Atsushi studied dentistry at Tokyo University. He made a PhD in neurophysiology, the same university, and moved to Rockefeller University as a postdoc. And he returned from Rockefeller as a professor, followed by his professorship at the university in Tokyo. He ended up 10 years ago in RIKEN, where he's doing very interesting things. He would like to understand human behavior, human cognition, by using models, monkey models, using both old world and new world monkeys. And I think Atsushi will explain in his lecture the recent status of the field, including his research.
Well, thank you very much, Balázs, for introduction and inviting me to this fantastic symposium. So actually, Balázs and myself talked about how I can carry on this lecture here and came up with this strange title, and which is a multi-dimensional approach to study the focus thing, which is a human cognition and the mechanism of its evolution. And before starting my talk, I want to make some connection with this East-West connection ideas and also the biological mechanisms. So this is a very super oversimplified contrast between Western way of thinking and Eastern way of thinking. It's often said that Westerners, well, so-called Westerners, are more reductionistic, and Easterners are more holistic. I heard some of these words in this morning as well. And probably these have historical and geographical and geopolitical background and natural environmental background to come up with this dichotomy, which I very much dislike. But anyway, reductionistic approach might come from the old Greco-Roman, like Platonic ideal way of thinking, who are mostly interested in materials or what the nature consists of. And on contrast, Eastern culture, mainly by Chinese tradition, I think, are more interested in how the world works, like I Ching, which is a book of changes, and Confucianism are interested in how to maintain society in order, or Taoism consists of how to look at how the nature is understood as it is. However, both of them, as Jean-Pierre pointed out this morning, that clearly that have commonality and has common concept. Of course, it does have a common concept because both of them are looking at the nature and materials. And to understand what and how are connected, there are nodes to connect these common structures, and there are principles to how to handle those. And that represents the reality of the world. So probably, to my opinion, this is just how the Western and Eastern culture have emphasized on which aspect of the nature. Probably they are interested in the elements of the nature, and they are interested in procedure, how it works. And if you look into the language structures and the way of thinking of the both cultures, you might become aware that in the Western languages, their words and concepts consist of elements, and their language structure or grammatic structures are reflected the how was connected. And in contrast, in Eastern, well, Chinese character-based culture, as Japanese are a part of that, the words are consisted of how, the procedures, way of how the things work. And to connect those how, we have to be aware of the what to be connected together with. So both have both elements, but comprising the word linguistic structures are different, meaning that both cultures are interested in the same thing, but have some perspectives differently looking at this nature. So just a matter of perspectives. Then what we can do as a scientist is that become free from this cultural or linguistic constraint or way of thinking, or taking advantage of the both. How to do that is what we need is the multidimensional approach to looking at this. Looking at elements, looking at procedures, looking at many things that are related and interacted with each other. I think the serious scientists all agree with this, but it's simply very difficult to do that. So this is a question I want to raise in the beginning, and how to organize my talk. And we cannot just keep complaining. We need some concrete subject to look at and need to have some window to dig into this reality. And what I am interested in is the neurobiological mechanism of the human cognition. This is my original interest, and how it came about during the course of evolution. And to do that as a principle, I would like to propose by the end of this talk the idea of triadic niche construction, which I cannot explain the detail now, but it's simplified. There's the three kinds of niches, which is ecological and neural and cognitive niches, emerge in our brain and environment and in the earth and so on. And they interact each other to form or shape, as a result of the evolutionary long time passage, the human cognition. And how to do that, taking advantage of the eastern and western crossing that Singapore is residing, to propose somehow what could be done here, particularly taking advantage of the geopolitical situation that the Singaporeans have. So this is the general structure of my talk. And let's go into the concrete details. As Balash explained, I'm interested in human cognition, but not studied directly. What I'm interested in, how it evolved, what kind of the changes our primate ancestors' brain brought into this human, or elevated their ability into human cognition or intelligence, and what kind of the changes are comprising these interesting structures. So I started with trained the monkeys with abnormal to them, which is thought to be the human characteristics. And first I started when I moved to RIKEN before that, about 15 years ago, to train the Japanese macaque with using tools, the rake. And usually it's said that old world monkeys never use tools, unlike chimpanzees or apes. They could be trained to use tools. It's not so easy for them, but it's not very difficult. They could be trained in like 2 weeks or 10 days. And in addition to rake task, they are not viewing this directly, but instead they are viewing from this camera. And this is, by the way, this is the oldest consumable available handycam by Sony, 1993. But anyway, he is looking at this scenery. And that's like a video game. We can install artificial spot here. And what monkeys do behave is that trying to take it like a video game. So probably the human kids are so crazy about a video game because our brain are equipped with doing this. And this is very rewardful. And so this means that he can project his body image into the video monitor, which is thought to be peculiar to humans. But they actually seem like doing that. But it's difficult to prove it. But to do that, I recorded the neural activity in the brain and to try to correspond it. But today's talk, this is a multi-dimensional approach. I cannot get into the too much detail of the individual data, but I just want to collect the bits of data and try to construct it. So I apologize for not being so detailed about the data. But just briefly, where I recorded the neural activity from in the beginning is from the parietal cortex, where the integrating somatosensory and visual information and there's many functions of parietal cortex, but one of them is to code the body image. The bodily spatial structure of the body shape in the space and try to relate it with the outer environmental space. This is called body image. And when we record the neural activity here, and those neurons have somatosensory receptive field. I think I don't have to explain about the receptive field in this audience, but they have tactile response. And at the same time, if you scan the space around this hand, this is the trajectory of the probe to scan it. The neuron fires when the probe approaching this somatosensory receptive field, but not touching it. So this is a visual response. And we can draw a visual receptive field around the hand or encompassing the somatosensory receptive field, by which we can claim or explain the phenomena as the neuron is coding the body image of the body by integrating different modalities of information in his brain to comprise what his body look like from outside. And then combined with the tool use and found that when the monkey was trained to use tools, by 2 weeks of training, this receptive field properties changes. Like if you assume that these neurons are coding the image of the body, this means that tool is incorporated into the body image and neurons are coding accordingly. Or alternatively, your body image was extended along the tools, which you introspectively experience when using various tools. And if you record the receptive field in the monitor by using that spot artificially superimposed as you saw before, you can detect the receptive field in the monitor, meaning that your body image is projected onto the monitor. You cannot claim that just behaviorally, but there's a neural evidence. It's very complementary to that explanation. Probably that is true. And there's many of these neurophysiological experiments that we can conduct, which we have been doing for many years, representing that we can modify their response properties by training. So that's the brain is not a fixed hardwired machinery to process a given information, but it can adapt to the environmental changes or training by, if you are not afraid of overexpression, you can educate the brain and modify their functions. And even the structure that we could find later that in these areas that we found bimodal neuron from, firstly, this is about 13 years ago, the experiment, we found gene expression. This is a kind of immediate early gene expressed particularly in that training period, particularly in that brain area. And this appears after the training was completed. So they have something to do with genetic information expressions in this part of the brain at doing something. This was the beginning of my study, looking for what kind of the brain structural and functional changes induced by artificial training, trying to adapt to the modified environment. You can put it this way. So that this training enables the monkey's brain changes in about 10 days to 2 weeks of time. And after that, monkey's brain activity become more flexible or more capacity furnished. And by gene expression, after some, we have been looking for like neurotrophic factor genes or many other kind of gene expressions here. And that resulted in the conclusion that that modifies the neural circuitry, at least at the microscopic level. By combination of the anterograde and retrograde tracer techniques, we found the axon extends a little bit. I cannot get into detail, but extends a little bit towards the cortical areas that we detected the modification of the receptive field properties. That's the combination of the visual and the somatosensory information. That was reflected by, in this case, some amount of the axonal growth is like a few hundred microns to 1 or 2 millimeters at most during 2 weeks of period, and extends to the superficial layers of the cortical area, which is the interparietal cortex at this time. And also by electron microscope, we found that new axospiny synapses, excitatory synapses, are formed in this microcircuitry. So actually, the training can induce a modification in the cortical microcircuitry to represent the local function of the brain. So the idea is that this is a very simplified schematic diagram to relate the human intelligence and brain function with the monkey brain function. The left column represents the oversimplified axis of the human brain from the primitive to more sophisticated levels of the intelligence or human patterns of human cognition. And this roughly corresponds to the developmental psychology claims and also educational claim that our intelligence starts from skillfulness or active representation, understand the meaning of the world through their actions by touching, moving, licking, so on, the baby starts with, and then change to the iconic or visual representation, understand by appearance of the things, and then come to the level of the linguistic or metaphysical or symbolic representation. Explain the things or understand the things by meaning, materials, structure, function, those abstract combination of the things. That's the logic. And finally, not everybody, but some of us, the most of us, can become a philosopher, and which that's slightly difficult for monkeys to become. But so this is very simplified one. Of course, the human intelligence is multidimensional, and there's many fragmental axis, but just for graphical reason, just simplified it in this way. And then this column here is that this is a human intelligence. N stands for normal human, born at this level, and through the development and education, adult human become philosopher. And it is often said that monkeys, old world monkeys, have an intelligence of human kids of like 2 years old, and chimpanzees have like 7 years old. There's many different opinions about it, but roughly this correspondence between development and evolution, that's a generally understood idea. That represent here. N stands for normal, and W stands for wild monkeys, capacity, born at this level, through development, they stop before using tools. So that's why the monkey's ability is like human babies. However, I think I could convince you that through the training, we can expand the monkey's spectrum of the intelligence to use tools, and we can manage the visual representation, body image, and so on. We cannot say to which extent we can soup up the monkey's brain faculty, but it's much wider, although artificial, than it used to be thought. And this gives you the platform of overlap between human cognition or intelligence and the trained monkey's cognition. That gives us opportunity to study the biological mechanisms of the human intelligence or cognition, like studying the biology of language, biology of thoughts, biology of whatever. And it looks like that true use training triggers many of these functions. And this gives rise to this expansion of the capacity. And maybe the tool use is not the only way to do that. There's many other ways to do that, but probably the governing principle behind it could be similar or the same. And tool use is one of the factors that triggered this expansion of the capacity. And that could be understood when you look at this column, which I didn't explain. W stands for wild. And if you want to compare the brain function and structure and activity with wild monkeys, the monkey as it is not fair to compare with educated or culturalized or civilized humans. However, at that time, we have to compare with a wild human brain. And there are sometimes those kind of comparisons and claims, but from the definition, we are not wild. That's why we are humans. So we cannot do that. However, if you think about this, there might be something happened during the evolutionary process that originally abled primate ancestor brain, there was subtle changes induced by we started training each other, or educating each other by the society or culture or whatever, and that prevented us from remaining wild and made us the culture or civilized human. And probably that might be just a subtle change of the gene transcription or neural circuitry or some subtle changes made a bifurcation of the fate of the brain of the monkey ancestors and human ancestors. And that could be another issue that we could study using this experimental paradigm. And then, coming back to the story, what could we study here? I tried to structuralize. The first thing I did was try to structuralize the human intelligence in, could be the various way, but I started with the two-use, so I wanted to expand this notion of the various tools co-evolved with human intelligence and also the human environment or civilization. And firstly, what I train the monkeys to use is the rake, which is the extension or the motor apparatus, or the most primitive way of intelligence for human to understand the world, which is the movement. And from the definition, I think all of the study related to use is restricted to this class of the tools, something held in your hand and interact with the environment and make an interaction with them. And this could be the definition of tools. However, if you think about the kind of the tools we are using, there's another class of the tools, which is the sensory tools, like externalized eye, camera, detector. These are the sensory tools that we use to enhance our sensory capacity. And I thought the monkey could be trained to do this very easily because it's just a different class of the tools. But I started this experiment when I moved to RIKEN in 2004 and failed the training for first 3-4 years. It was a very difficult time. And there was something missing in this way of thinking. And then what I came up with is that those layered structure of human intelligence. And this sensory tool might be constructed on top of the already acquired motor tools. So there must be some order or structure of the tool use or kind of the tools that humans or the primate ancestors are using. And then what we did, and I have to realize it, is I just attached a small mirror at the tip of the rake and trained the monkey to do this. This is the hump. The monkey cannot see this thing, but we can manipulate the mirror. So this is not the externalized eye or the tool using or the sensory tool using, but surprisingly, this is a very easy step for monkey to do. It could be done in 3 days or so. So this is just, I thought, I have trained as a dentist, and this is like a dental mirror to look into the mouth. And this is one of the easiest steps you can do. And so this is something acquired already, the motor tools. And I attached a sensory cue on tip. And after the acquisition of the skill to modify the body image, you just install the sensory cue on top of that, and then start to differentiate it. And finally, by step, there are like 3 or 4 kinds of steps, but I just skip it. But finally, we attached a small camera on the tip of the rake, and we made this plate transparent. And it's like an endoscope or gastro camera that the physicians use to peek into your stomach. And monkey can do that. So this is like gripping out your eyeball with hand and attached to the end of the motor apparatus and looking into the world. So this is a sensory tool. And they are the neural correlates for this behavior. But anyway, monkey could be trained by step-by-step, or structurized construction of intelligence could be leveled up to this level. So this is external side, and monkey can do that. And the next question is, what happens when you look yourself by your own externalized eye? This is kind of a third-person perspective of yourself, or meta self-recognition, which is also slightly difficult for even the humans to acquire. Both culture, West and East, have this concept of somebody looking from the top, and you have to objectify yourself and control, self-control. That is the source of a human intelligence or well-behaved human being behavior. And this is something difficult to acquire, even the humans. But that needs this kind of a structure to visualize yourself on the third-person perspective, to look into yourself. By doing that, you recognize the continuation of existence from yourself, from the past, present to the future. The non-human animals are very immediate animals. Even most of the humans are. We are very living in the present and usually don't care about the future. But by acquiring this structure, we can have the concept of the core self and existence or continuation across the time, extending to the future. And then what we would like to use is we can externalize the memory. If you acquire something useful information at present, to keep it for a while for future usage, like taking a memorandum, or it's like an external memory device. And this this is externalized brain. We are now developing very quickly. And then, so these kind of layers of structure could be experimentally tested in the macaque monkey model. So what here is that using this structure can expand this monkey capacity and trying to incorporate many humanistic behavior besides tool use, like imitation, the mirror self-recognition, what I said, just joint attention, the meta self-recognition. This all connected to human mind or concept. And these are the factors, what was claimed before, do not exist in non-human animals. Probably they don't need it. That's why they don't have it. They are very economically efficient, cost efficient. If it is not needed, don't do that. And the environment doesn't require them to use this concept. But somehow the human capacity was expanded by, maybe accidentally, but by some phenomena, and came to this future-oriented way of thinking. And how does this idea fit into the theory of evolution? If you think about theory of evolution, many people think about it as natural selection, a combination of the mutation and natural selection, which is conventional origin of the species like evolutionary theory, Darwinian. But Darwin also proposed the concept of the niche construction. The activity of organism modify the environmental niche and they adapt to that environment. And this is not just the happenings of the mutation and accidental natural selection. Activity of the biological organism can modify the environment. The typical example is a beaver. Beaver is like a rat or fox or whatever, living in the mountain, but they create a dam and create a new niche with aqueous environment, like a lake or pond, and their body shape and their way of thinking probably adapted that environment. But this is an example of the niche construction typically used. But beaver do not improve their constructions. You know, the humans are always thinking of the better future, a more rich future, a more comfortable environment, and improved environment because we have a concept of the future and planning for the future. But in the beaver, non-human primate case, they accidentally create a new niche, and they are satisfied because they can occupy and monopolize their niche, and nothing else is needed. So in this case, the beaver's kind of niche construction is just a single loop. You stop there because there's no necessity. But since the humans are very strange animals, we are always thinking about the future improvement. And then this is kind of the multiple loop, positive feedback loop, which was driven by intention. And then, so I call it, this is the ecological niche construction, and following the original niche construction concept. The activity modifies the environment. And then, coming back to the tool use, like you invent the tools, and tools are embedded in the environment, like these cars or buildings. These are kind of the tools we are living in. Then we start adapting to this new environment. The environment can modify the tools, modify the brains by feedback, to pressurize the brain to adapt it. And I just showed you the microscopic level of the changes in the microcircuitry and synapse formation. But recently found by voxel-based morphometry, the structure imaging, digital imaging, and detected through the 2 weeks of true-use training period. This is not a functional MRI, this is structure MRI, and detected up to 23% of the increase of the gray matter signals in various areas, mostly around the parietal cortex, which we found the bimodal neuron from, and which we found modification neurocircuitry. And this 23% increase in every one individual animal, a great increase. And there have been a study that a collection of the, say, mathematicians and musicians, but average of 30 people correcting as a group, it could be a few percent, 2-3% of differences between professionals and the amateurs. But in this case, since the tool use is something very much novel to these animals, this makes a great expansion. And we are now looking what concrete biological mechanisms are happening. So anyway, this means that the brain adapts to the modified ecological niche to create more pieces of the brain tissue, which I called it neural niche construction. Create a new neural niche in the brain corresponding to the ecological niche. So this is a second class of the niches that constructed by interactions. And what are these parietal cortex doing in monkey brain and human brain? So by 2 years training, we found expansion of this area. And this is claimed as something human-specific brain area, handling acalculia, asymbolia, or sort of abstract language faculties. And what are these brain areas doing? Is that these are originally surrounded by primary sensory cortices, or somatosensory, auditory, and visual, both in monkeys and humans. And what are they doing is that they are creating the motions. They are just converging the spatial coordinate systems in various movement and organs, like eye movement, hand movement, or head movement, or body movement. If you plot the cortical areas controlling this movement or coordinate transformation functions, the whole parietal cortex of the macaque brain is occupied by these functions. So, and these are the functions that monkeys are necessitated in arboreal living in the forest. And that's why they claim, and evolutionary scientists claim that monkeys' parietal cortex expanded after living in the forest. And this made a lot of differences afterwards. But in the humans, you can plot the identical function in this area, but many other rooms in between happening there. So humans are further expanded with the parietal cortex when doing something else. And this is another portion of the niche version of the niche, neural niche construction, applying to the human parietal cortex. And what are these? Yes?
Sorry, did you have a condition when the monkey was exposed to the same amount of visual stimulation of its whole body without the action?
And the VVM study?
Yeah. So could it be that this is
Actually, we haven't made a direct control with that. But if that is the case, the same amount of expansion should emerge in other cortical areas related to that function.
at least in the human brain, the IP is, I don't know whether they are how excellent, I'm not really sure about it, but the IP in the human brain is usually sensitive for spatial arrangements and spatial organizations.
In parietal cortex. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And those spatial organization is related to not just the configuration. Probably it is often claimed as many other human-specific functions, like a logical reasoning or so many, more abstract way of thinking. And that's what to claim after this. And anyway, maybe we can talk later about the discussion period. And what are these areas in between are doing? It's not just a spatial transformation but the idea is applying the same information processing principle to more interesting things. And we did a meta-analysis and collected the non-spatial cognition studies, about 100 of them, and plotted the focus of the activation in monkeys and human parietal cortex. Basically, this is a spatial processing area, so we excluded those spatial processing studies, but direct spatial processing study. But this color code indicates, I think I don't have, again, I'm sorry that I don't have enough time to explain in detail, but they're handling different subject or object in relation to the spatial structures, like temporal space, social space, conceptual space. It's metaphorically named somewhat spaces, but it's not actual physical space. For example, the social space relation with you and me, and there's a hierarchical top-down and width, and that's all the spatial structures. And also thinking about a conceptual space, thinking about abstract concept. In any language, there's a metaphor of the space in relation to how you think about it. Like a bridge, the idea, something underneath it, behind the structure, as a basis of and built as the logic on top of that. It's all handling with the spatial information processing patterns, but applied to the different cognitive functions, like mathematics, logics, languages. There's many of those. And I named this cognitive niche construction. By acquired or expanded neural niche and applying the same principle, the human ancestors or human Homo sapiens ancestors created the new cognitive niches, including language or civilization. And then the idea is that these three kind of niches interact with each other. We create the new cognitive niche that modify further the environment by improving it. We can invent economic structures and political structures, social structures, that all based on this information principle. So from the natural selection to intentional niche construction we just talked to you before, there's a triadic niche construction of the interaction between three kinds of niches, portion of the environment interact with each other, and portion of the brain that expand, provide with the new resources to think about, and resulting in the new way of thinking that then feed back to the environment and so on. This is a triadic niche construction. And what is good about this idea is that you can explain the human mind, human-specific mind, and link the cognitive niche, which is a culture or humanity work, and ground it onto the biological mechanisms. And I haven't talked about the biological mechanism, concrete biological mechanism yet, because I'm now doing that. I just wanted to present a conceptual framework. What is this cognitive triadic niche construction is how it is good about. And the biological mechanism that we should study as a scientist, neurobiologist, is what Jean-Pierre presented this morning, mostly through the epigenetic or extragenomic, probably. This is the best candidate we have now. And if we include this mechanism, which is a little bit apart or beyond the existing evolutionary theory, but it's something just started hanging around, and then come to the evolution theory. If you think about evolution of the evolutionary theory, that evolves like every 70 years. We have been educated as a scientist, as a Darwinian natural selection as a default. But it was only proposed 150 years ago by original species. It's here. That concept comprised of three concepts, which is variation of the species, or genetic patterns, or inheritance and natural selection. That was it. And at that time, we didn't know about the DNA and the genes and so on. But the conceptual proposal of that. And Darwin actually thought that this was a continuation. This is not discrete inheritance. There's the debate with Mendel and so on. I think you are not all familiar with that. And after the discovery of the DNA and genes, Darwin's natural selection almost extinguished, died out. But there's a genius with Julian Huxley, the modern synthesis. They synthesized with the genetic idea and Darwinian natural selection and came up with a neo-Darwinism that included more concepts like this. It's okay? And this is 70 years after this. And now it is about 70 years after modern synthesis. And there's many concepts hanging around. It's called extended synthesis, for example. And that includes epigenetics, evolutionary theory, niche construction. There's many other concepts that we can study. And that can link the culture with the biology. And there must be something to do with the brain mechanism to do that. And now this is 70 years and 70 years. It's about time to get another stage of the evolutionary theory. And what we can study that. And from now on, I don't have a concrete data yet, but I am scheming for scientific framework and also want to propose something could be done here, taking advantage of this Singapore. And to think about this epigenetic or extragenomic mechanisms, what we can do is compare identical species doing different things. And why is that in relation to environmental structure? And also, on the other hand, vice versa, compare the different species doing the same thing. And if you reason it with this interaction, we can do that. And Singapore, we can do both. And I can show you the example. And this is long-tail macaques living in the Burmese. And macaques are thought not to be tool users in a natural habitat. But it could be trained to use tool in Japanese monkey, as I showed you before. But in this Burmese macaques, actually, this is Michael Gume from the HSS here. He is studying the field study on these macaques. And I just went early this year to explore the island, isolated island with him, and found most of the macaques live there, use stone tools, much more skillful than chimpanzees. This is natural acquisition of the intelligence behavior. And same species, long-tailed macaques living in the mainland, never use tools. Probably there are some environmental factors driven them to be a tool user. And I think I have a video for that. And this is very interesting video. Since this is isolated island, we can observe only from the boat. And this is group of macaques coming down to the beach, and everybody started using tools. The stone tools like this, the cracking. And here, they're using that. And you can see that this is very popular and common behavior. And there are the babies here start doing the tools, and there's a mutual education observation happening here. So there might be this probably because of these are in the isolated islands, are free from the predators, and there's many oysters around, and there's a rich nutrition. And if you can get food with a very short of time, and with a rich nutrition, there'll be a spare time. And there's more time to think, not worry about the predators. And that pressurize the brain to do more interesting things. Actually, in this field, the population density of the macaques are much, much higher than in the mainland. The environment here can feed them and give them time and no threat for the human to be predated. So that's one thing we can explore. And now we are aiming a scheme to compare this species with mainland species by probably the simple comparison between the brain structure by BVM can detect. We don't have a data yet. We cannot say can detect some differences, and we can rate with, if we can rate with epigenetic modification by like the buccal mucosa swab or whatever, it's probably the first step we can do, and then we can detect something that's fundamentally essential for this triadic niche construction. So this is identical species doing different things depending on the evolutionary history or geographical modifications. Another thing is the marmoset in the New World monkey. And last year, I went to Brazil to look for the marmoset. And the idea is that marmoset have very much common behavior with humans, including social behavior, interactions, vocal communication, memories, and so on. There's many of those. And they are small animals, and they have very short reproduction cycle, so easy to apply for experimentation. And observing this natural habitat, we can extract the characteristic of the human-specific features in these marmoset monkeys. And why the marmoset monkeys? Originally thought to be the very primitive, are actually not. And also, this is the equator. The marmoset habitation is here. And this is almost identical with Singaporean. So probably it's easy for Singapore to acquire the marmoset studies here on site in a natural environment. But anyway, so why is it? So the idea is the marmoset is not a primitive monkeys. It's just different. So this is evolution. I'm sorry for this Japanese, but I thought this is very clear to explain the fact is that the simians and prosimians, New World monkeys and Old World monkey bifurcated about 35 million years ago. So that's why marmoset thought primitive, but it's actually not. And in the Old World, the first evolved species was apes, great apes. There's not very few Old World monkeys. It was dominated by apes. And all the Old World niches were occupied by human ancestors. And after this was almost extinguishing, and the humans are almost endangered species, by the way. And there's more numbers of Old World monkeys emerged afterwards. They occupied the rest of the niches. So there was some mechanism and differences between Old World and New World. And there's a theory about evolution, the crown evolution and stem evolution. The stem evolution is branching of this large branching by physical separation. And this is called stem evolution. And within the same niche, but niche segregation and niche construction of the identical species sharing the same environmental structures is called crown evolution. That is convergence of divergence, or there's merging of many interesting happenings. There's two classes of evolution. And if you apply this idea to the primate evolution theory, what we can extract here is that from Afro-Eurasia continent, by the continental drift, the primate ancestors bifurcated in Old World and New World. In the New World, there's no humans until very recently. About 10,000 years ago, humans immigrated, Afro-African came here. But in the New Old World, as I told you, the first dominating species was apes and the human ancestors. And probably by niche construction segregation mechanisms, all the human-specific features were accumulated in the human. That's why we're humans. And the rest of the species sharing the same niche it's beneficial for them to avoid the human-specific characters and share their own niches, occupy their own niche. In contrast, since the New World, there's no human existed, probably human-specific trait could be diverged or segregated in different New World monkey species. There's very little studies about detailed New World monkey species, primate, neurobiology or whatever in the biology. So we don't know yet. But we can assume that some of the human-specific trait, including language or tool use or whatever, expressed in different species in a different niche segregation manner. And to start with, we did some genetic analysis of the gene, language-related genes, like a dyslexia genes, speech genes. There's many of them candidates, and extracted 14 candidates. By the way, this is in preparation. We are not publishing yet, but we compared the 6 primate species: human, chimpanzees, gorilla, orangutan, rhesus monkey, marmoset, and we recently added a Neanderthal gene as well, and compared these language-related genes. And surprisingly, or as expected, we found most commonality between marmoset and humans than chimpanzees and humans, probably meaning that there's some mechanism that human spectral trait remained in marmoset brain mechanisms by the mechanisms of the triadic niche construction. So marmoset is not the primitive primate, but they are modern primate adapted to the modern evolutionary environment through the history of evolution. And this could be one model that we can study. And experimentally, this is the most beneficial model because it's small and interesting. And we recently just started creating a dynamic machine to extract the modification of the behavior and try to relate with the biological mechanisms. The machine is still on the way. We don't have a concrete result yet. Is that this is equipped with housing cage, which is about this size. It's sufficient to house like 10 or 15 marmoset, which is a family unit of the marmoset, and live in here. And one sticking out here is a small chamber equipped with each equipped computer or touch screen. And you can do, it's like a Skinner box. You can do any psychological test batteries here. And marmoset come here ad barium, whenever they like. And they can have food only from this platform. So they like to come here. And all the data are accumulated in central computer and analyze it later. I can explain later. And at the same time, we are developing multi-electrode and also surface electrode developed together with the Italian group. And this is surface coated with a carbon nanotube. So you can all at the same time record and stimulate the surface, and you can intervene into the brain function. And this was all telemate and passed wireless to the computer and collect with the behaviors. And in the test battery, in this chamber here, each chamber can be equipped with individual or independent test batteries. And we have developed for marmoset these different kinds of test battery which can correspond or model the human disease of this in this column. And this could be combined and changed and could be presented independently in different chambers. And since these are using like an iPad system with a camera and touch screen, the marmoset can choose the partner marmoset to Skype in the different chambers. So this you can detect the social interactions. And all of these data can continuously acquired in the central computer. And the whole idea is that this multidimensional adaptive data collection machine here can house the group of the marmoset freely interacting in a social manner. And all the data from this neural data and the psychological data are collected continuously for 24 hours a day for 7 days a week. And it's a kind of a big data. And we just developed a complexity program search engine, a detection engine, to characterize, extract the dynamical phase transition pattern of this multidimensional data sets, or big data sets. And then what good about this system is that through this network theory, we can extract some hypothesis automatically and feed back to this individual computer and modify the parameters to contrast those characteristics more rapidly. It's kind of artificial evolution, behavioral evolution happening in this small chamber. And we can relate that with molecular genetic mechanisms or neural mechanisms. And so this is a holistic or Eastern house system machine interacting with the environment and holistic system. And we can correlate with Western Watt system or reductionistic mechanism to extract the neural recording pattern and neural activity patterns or microcircuitry or morphology like anatomy we heard last time or molecular or genetic mechanism and reduce it and trying to relate this. So this is by installing this mechanism through the ideas of Eastern-Western connection, we might be able to extract the principle of how the human intelligence or cognition evolved through the evolutionary history. And that can take most advantage of the location of Singapore. That I want to propose. I haven't done it, but I think we can do that most efficiently here. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Atsushi. So we have plenty of time for discussion. Please, questions.
You have been using the word mind as a conclusion of your talk. I like very much the three niche construction and so on. And so you believe that the mind is an entity? I had a lot of problems with the Japanese postdocs I had in the past decades to try to translate the word esprit in French into Japanese. And they said that the word does not exist in Japanese.
Yeah, that's many of those.
And I had also a discussion with specialists in the original Buddha writings in Japan. And I asked him whether the same question. And he says, no, in the Oriental tradition, we believe that the higher function of the brain is physiology. So,
well,
first of all, do you agree with this interpretation of the East-West tradition? Or, first of all, is it true? And second, you use the word mind. And we may not use the word mind. I don't think it's an entity, at least from my point of view, which has a scientific meaning.
Well, I very much understand your problem with Japanese student about talking about the mind. And that is a very tricky and complicated question and problems. And well, the conclusion is that in the probably common in Chinese tradition, the mind cannot be translated in Japanese language. So the equivalent, what we think equivalent term in Japanese, the mind, is called kokoro. And the equivalent word of mind in Japanese include many other concepts than mind, like spirits, heart, say like soul. Difficult to compare. Probably many of you have shared the same. That's a problem of the translation. As I show you in the first slide, they have very different trait of the culture origin, yet they have some commonality. When you translate the concept, what you do, or what we do, is trying to find a similar analogous term or concept from other culture and trying to relate it. And that is a translation. It is okay for the superficial level or in the very beginning level, but if you dig into the very depth of the concept, it's totally different. And to explain or translate a single word, any single word, not just a mind, needs like hundreds of pages of literature explaining.
I think I don't want to occupy the discussion.
So,
but you know, if you want to make also a comparison between Oriental and Occidental tradition, the West has been plagued by one concept, which is from Plato, which is the dualism, which has been taken by Descartes, which supposes that the soul is different from the body and from the brain. And there have been a lot of mistakes and misunderstandings which have been caused by that. And I may say I was pleased that the Oriental tradition did not make this mistake.
Well, Oriental tradition make another mistake, but I don't continue too much, but Descartes was aware of that, and he was modestly expressing in this discourse, the methodology, about this dualism, but it's often ignored later. But I think he was aware of this danger of this dualism. But well, we can talk later. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Regarding one of your first couple of slides where we were comparing humans and non-humans, let's say apes or whatever, and with respect to the evolution, and you said somewhere, I think something like, well, we don't know how far this can go, maybe up to the, let's say, philosophical, metaphysical. Would there not be a natural limit to that direction? I mean, namely language. For instance, I tend to think that philosophy is not possible without language. And okay, animal language, there's lots of discussion about, well, it exists, but is it the kind of language that we could philosophize with and stuff like that? So just in general, is there no threshold above which you cannot go?
And that's
principle.
Well, principle is yes and no.
Uh-huh.
And
that's always with principles,
I'm sorry,
right?
it's not principle. And that depends on in which evaluation axis you settle the threshold. If you settle the threshold in humanistic, well, the human characteristic axis, there should be a limitation. Non-human animals are never be humans. However, they have their own capacity. And the humans have a very severe threshold related to their capacity. And that's all relative. So I think the concept of the threshold in I wrote in single dimension, that was a mistake. But anyway, single dimension and settle the threshold and compare the level, that is very much misleading.
So you wouldn't exclude the possibility of a monkey philosophy then?
Well, they should have their own philosophy.
Yeah, right. That's what I was wondering.
But how you define the philosophy again? That's another problem.
I'll do that later in the talk.
Interested by your different niche and the presentation and the relationship between this niche and the brain and the evolution of the brain. And concerning language, it is something that I don't see emerging from these three niches. And you have the ecological, the cognitive, and the biological. Okay? So what about the social?
Well, I included the social language in the cognitive
the language is a remarkable tool which has been developing in the course of human evolution, but at some steps that you don't analyze because they are beyond the monkeys, because they are ancestors which have disappeared from the earth. But the social niche, why don't you put one there?
I mean, and separate from three kind of niches, the social niches? Well, I can think about it, but
because the language is really something which has to do with social life.
Yeah, I understand it. But tentatively, social and linguistic niches are included in a cognitive niche in the scheme. But we can separate it or analyze it in a different way of looking at it. But neural and ecological and cognitive very strikingly contrast with each other. So if you think about the social, linguistic, cognitive niche, something have some similarity. So that's why I include it as the same group. But of course, I don't be so constrained with this idea. I think that's wrong too. And, then let's come to that previous question.
Yes.
Yeah.
What are the missing steps? And what language is one of them? And the other one is perhaps, I don't know if you agree on that, working memory, the capacity of the
Well, then, talking about language or the working memory, there are precursors. No. Monkey. The extent of the complexity and language have boosted the capacity of that. And if the monkeys have precursory function of the linguistics function and also the working memory, they definitely have it. But the question is the size, capacity of that, quantitative differences. And that is a big question. And if you remain into just a quantitative, continuational quantitative difference, we can train them. But there must be some threshold that quantitative changes crosses to the phase transfer to the qualitative changes.
Which is emerging from quantitative change, the fact that...
so there's some
that
phase transition.
Can I intervene here? No, not just an intervention. Because I was working with some guys on a language issue, and it has turned out that animals like your monkeys, when they are foraging, so looking for food, and going into a forest or somewhere, they can easily find back to the origin place if they have made 4 branchings. That is to say, main road, second road, and so on. And they can still come back. And linguists realized it, at least in Indo-European languages. On the average, you can put 4 clauses in a sentence. Not more, not... So, I mean, then you are losing.
Not in a legal document.
Not in a legal document. But it means, and this is a very interesting similarity, that foraging animal monkeys and we humans who are using language can go 4 branching on the average, and that's it.
But the monkeys don't make a reasoning reply.
Yeah, I understand, but it's a similarity.
There's some common principle behind it, and we can. I have all my idea, but it has never been concluded at this point. So we can continue this discussion forever and ever.
Okay, so I would like to pick up on the concept of, why wild humans should be studied, as you sort of proposed. Because you see, looking at your triadic niche construction, just can't really place a wild human as opposed to a Burmese macaque into this triad of niches. Could you elaborate on that, please, a little?
What do you say? You cannot?
I myself cannot put a wild human, into a completely different niche, as opposed to.
I didn't say that. Well, that's a kind of thought experiment. I just made it to provoke you, the audience. That
are there, wild humans exist, in your opinion?
There's some accidental happenings that triggered the prevention teaching with each other, the maker society. And we don't know that.
You mean individuals would exist there, as individuals?
In individual at the same time. And it happens simultaneously, then it may be beneficial. But that exact point cannot be studied by this Burmese macaque. What could be studied is the more fundamental principles, whether environmental, accidental changes, like a separation from the continent with a small isolated island, made differences in their bifurcation depending on the epigenetic factors, not with a genetic mutation in advance. But thinking about the genetic assimilation or Baldwin effect, that modification happened within the capacity of adaptation or plasticity, may be controlled by epigenetic modification without genetic modification. That shifts the central, say, average. And then genetic assimilation happens, this is just a hypothesis, happen later to assimilate into select those mutation that direct toward that direction is selected because of this modification, modified interaction between environment and the genetic expression. And then the genetic modification or evolution follows later, and which cannot explain by the mutation, just the mutation, neutral mutation and the environmental changes, but something, interactions, intervention with each other. So that is the point. And that kind of, say, accidental mutation could have happened in our old human ancestors. That triggered this trait. Okay. That was the story I just came up with, thought experiments.
Just a quick rejoinder to what you said, Balázs. What you were describing is, I think, it's very real, of course, when you compare the monkey behavior and the language. But what you're describing linguistically is what is called recursivity. Recursivity is, of course, the embedding that is possible, and it goes up to, for some people say 7. But the thing is that with monkeys or whatever, when people talk about monkey or animal language, some people, Chomsky, for instance, and others would claim that there is no recursivity there. Bird song stuff they investigated, all tried to investigate, and that would make the fundamental difference there. I will talk about it a little bit recursively in my talk, but that would be the idea there.
Probably it's interesting to listen to the linguist here. There must be linguists in our audience.
Are you a linguist?
Are you a linguist?
Yeah, well, also.
Any further questions? If not, thank you.
Thank you very much.